Okay, yeah, so I'm particularly thrilled and incredibly privileged to introduce our first keynote speaker today. As mentioned, Dr. Stephen Jackson is a distinguished professor of information science and science and technology studies, and also the vice provost for academic innovation at Cornell University. Dr. Stephen Jackson has deeply influenced our understanding of how technology interrelates with society and the environment. His work addresses questions of technology ethics, law and policy, infrastructure, repair, sustainability, and global development. Dr. Jackson has published more than 90 peer-reviewed papers, given various keynotes around the world, and has been the recipient of more than 20 paper awards at leading venues in the computing and information science fields. He is also the former chair of Cornell's Information Science Department and former dean of William Keaton House. Additionally, Dr. Jackson also convenes the Computing on Earth Lab, an experimental collaboration that brings together social scientists, humanists, artists, engineers to rethink the material and planetary foundations of computing. With Dr. Jackson's rich and multifaceted background, one piece of work shines through as particularly influential and resilient over time: his seminal essay, Rethinking Repair. The essay is a powerful exploration of repair and challenges traditional views of technology by emphasizing the importance of repair as an integral part of our relationship with technological systems. Rather than seeing repair as a minor reactive process, Dr. Jackson has argued that it is central to understanding how technology endures, adapts, and impacts society. His ideas encourage a shift towards valuing maintenance and care in technology, design, and public policy. Dr. Jackson, your work was also highly influential on my work when I was a doctoral student many years ago. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all as we invite Dr. Stephen Jackson to share his valuable insights with us today. So let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, thank you so much for that too kind introduction. Actually, before I get going, we didn't have a chance to properly thank the organizing committee, so if you could join me in a round of applause for all the people who helped bring this together. I'm very excited to be here. When Tenno reached out a while ago, last year or something, I was intrigued. And I can only say that the event is fully living up to my ill-formed hopes about it. And I particularly enjoyed the events yesterday, and I'm very excited to dive into the stuff this afternoon, where actually some of the stuff I'll be talking about is developed in much greater detail. So some things here are kind of like stay tuned for more development from the rest of the great work to come. So I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to start out at Tenno's invitation, talking a little bit about repair in a general sense, and this idea of broken world thinking. Some of you have seen this work, some of you certainly haven't. I'm going to turn then to a line of work, kind of an extensive program of work that is partly caught up in that and partly extended out from that for me over the last 10 to 15 years, really. And I'm going to conclude with a point on a connection that I think is embedded in the concept of repair for me from the very beginning, but I've been interested in kind of drawing out and theorizing a little more explicitly and directly, and that's the concept of hope, and in particular a principle of ordinary hope that I'll say a little bit about and invite you to comment and discuss as we talk about the event going forward. Okay, so the first part, for repair and broken world thinking. I did publish a paper about 10 years ago which tries to develop some of these ideas, and I'll say just a little bit about that here. It was called simply Rethinking Repair, and it made or tried to make a number of points. So this is one. This is really where the title of the talk is taken from. And what I want you to see in this is that this is both a statement about the world. The world is always breaking. It's in its nature to break. but also a statement about what we ought to pay attention to, what matters in our understandings of the world, what matters in our practices, and in particular, what matters in our scholarly attention to the world, right? Because part of my concern in writing this piece and a bunch of my work since then is simply that as scholars, and I'm a scholar, we're sometimes looking at the wrong things. We're sometimes putting emphasis on certain parts of human experience, and we're leaving other vast and potentially more important parts of human experience to the side. There's actually another thing that's embedded here that I think is pretty foundational, and I actually see this as a line, as a very strange kind of line you can draw through really most of philosophy and the social sciences more generally, which is what is the nature of the world and what therefore is to be explained. So change or stasis, process or structure, right? So there's a certain tradition within the social sciences and within philosophy and within just thinking about the world, which says that basically the world is there, it's stable, it's in place. And as a social scientist, your job is to explain when things change, right? Anything that changes is what needs to be explained. But there's another way of thinking about the world, which is to say the world is basically fractal. The world is always in process and under threat of flying apart. And therefore, under that imagination of the world, the thing to be explained is how anything stays together at all. And so it's this second way of thinking that I want to bring out a little bit more, and in which this broken world thinking is trying to name, however clumsily. Of course, for me, it's also a way, it's embedded in a set of debates, as was already mentioned, that I have with the technology world. So I'm in a computer and information science department. I'm sort of a weird figure in that environment, but I do spend a lot of time working with technology and technologists. And a part of my broken world thinking ideas and the computing on Earth ideas that you'll hear a bit more about shortly are really my effort to bring a different way of thinking into that environment. And it's a little cathartic, right? So partly this is me venting on things about my local worlds that I find very frustrating. Okay, there's a second part of this, though, as well. And this ties to the connection to hope I'll try and make more apparent later on. And that's really attending to the myriad acts of maintenance and repair by which systems and infrastructures, when they persist, remember, that's not guaranteed, actually persist. So this is the wonder of this piece. If there's a sense that I hope comes through in the piece, it's a sense of wonder and appreciation for that part of it, right? An appreciation, but actually a sense of wonder in kind of the original sense about how this work happens. And what I argue in the piece is that this sense of wonder and this appreciation for the acts of maintenance and repair are almost universally sidelined by many of the stories we tell about technology in the world, but also many stories we tell about the world in general. And in particular, I like that this this event puts together repair and innovation, because I think any healthy, real-world, hopeful sense of innovation going forward for me needs to have repair built into it. I think what more often happens is that innovation is framed as kind of the opposite of maintenance and repair. And for me, what that results in is a thin, insufficient, and deeply troubling and problematic notion of innovation, which ends up destroying, in many cases, the kinds of practices we actually need to move the world forward, to move the planet forward. Incidentally, do people know the origins of innovation? This is the word, the etymology of innovation. Have people encountered this before? All right, so the first time innovation shows up as a concept, it actually shows up as a charge of religious heresy. So it's actually a Spanish Inquisition term. So innovation was, at a certain point in time, innovation was about religious heresy, and innovation was what got you burned at the stake. So I think it's so interesting that this word, which has now become actually, ironically, almost a religious term today in many cases in our cultures, actually has a religious, a pretty shadowy religious origin. Okay, so as those who have seen the piece will know, the piece took immediate inspiration from a number of sources. A lot of them are actually non-scholarly in a traditional sense. So I encountered many years ago and was really blown away by this beautiful photography series by Canadian photographer Edward Bertinsky called the Shipbreaking series. This happens to be Shipbreaking number 9, but it's a whole series of photographs that follows the processes by which ocean ships are driven up and dismantled on the beaches of Bangladesh. And this is the main source of steel and iron in Bangladesh. There's no sort of homegrown steel industry. Most of the steel in the country actually comes from processes like this and from actors like this. So if you follow the series through, it never gets a lot more complicated than what you see here. This is literally groups of people with ropes and chains and blowtorches taking apart ocean liners. Right? It's a pretty phenomenal series and a phenomenal process. As a Canadian, I have to have a little Canadian content. So this is Leonard Cohen, a beautiful line from a piece called Anthem, poem and song called Anthem. There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. So for me, this is just the best single pithy way of showing to me kind of that connection between failure and breakdown and brokenness, but actually also beauty and hope and moving forward. Ironically, I had to pay Sony Music $500 to use this in the piece, which was kind of ironic, but there you go. And then finally, this is a little more kind of social science, philosophy, nerdy, but as a grad student, one of the pieces that most kind of grabbed me, those of you who have been grad students, who have studied in this way, might have an experience of like reading a piece and just kind of the world standing still for a minute, like it just kind of sinks in for you. Something just clicks or crystallizes in that moment. And for me, it was this, one of those moments was this beautiful essay by Walter Benjamin called The Angel of History. And he's commenting on a Paul Klee painting, which you can see reproduced here, which talks about the Angel of History, which is the name of the Klee painting and Benjamin's interpretation of it. And it's his vision of progress. It's his understanding of what progress might look like from the standpoint of the Angel of History. And for him, as you see, for Benjamin's description, the Angel of History, it has this incredibly, it's got this incredible sense of pathos. The Angel of History is caught, his wings are open, caught in a storm blowing for paradise, and he sees what is called progress piling up as wreckage at his feet as he blows backwards blindly into the future. And to me, it's one of the most stunning indictments of progress. And we could talk a little bit more about Benjamin. He comes into some of my thinking about hope as well. So this is basically it. It's very simple. The world is always breaking. It's in its nature to break. That breaking is generative and productive. It's also consequential, and many of the things we care about as media and technology scholars in this context, but I think in many other fields as well, turn out to be implicated in precisely such moments. And it's always being recuperated and reconstituted through repair. The question then becomes what we make of those facts and what we do next. And the what we do next part is always a central concern to me. So we reach an understanding, we come to see the world in a particular way, we come to act in the world in a particular way. Now what? What comes next? Okay, so there's sort of to give a bit of background then to the piece, there's sort of two ways into this, and there's a theory road, if you want, and there's an empirical road. And I'll give you the theory road first, although the empirical road is just as important. I don't want to do the thing where we imagine one's more important than the other. So for me, this sensibility comes out of my engagement with science and technology studies, and in particular, sort of a subfield within that area called infrastructure studies. These were two of my advisors, Susan Lee Starr and Jeff Bowker, and in the 1990s, working at kind of the intersection of the social sciences and what's now sometimes called computer-supported cooperative work, which is sort of a blended field that brings together people who study how humans and organizations work and think with people who design technologies. They came up with this piece on infrastructure and this theory of infrastructure that's become fairly influential in the computing, human-computer interaction field ever since. So I'm not going to talk through all of the features of this, One thing I will note, if we look at the two reded areas, the notion of change in infrastructure. So infrastructure is dependent on an installed basis of practices and material, and therefore that's also its mode of evolution. It grows and changes in modular chunks. This is not a revolutionary theory of infrastructure. This is an adjusting theory of infrastructure. And then the part that really connects probably most directly to the broken world thinking ideas is this idea that infrastructure is invisible until breakdown. Kind of that's probably the most distinctive feature of this, meaning that infrastructure, when it's operating smoothly, disappears into the world. It disappears almost literally into the woodwork, and it moves away. It escapes from conscious thought or reflection. It only reappears to conscious thought and reflection at the moment it breaks. So you can think about this as the world disclosing properties of breakdown, right? Most of the systems that actually govern and structure our lives are things that literally become invisible to us. They become habitualized, they become routinized until they break. When they break, we see things about the world that we hadn't noticed before. The other thing I'll note on this is what we would call its relational quality. So Lee Starr was fond of commenting on saying things like, one person's infrastructure is another person's barrier, right? So a very classic example, this is a super common example. These stairs, which I used and most of you used to come in from the back, I guess we all came in from the back. For most of us, that's infrastructure, right? For me, that's infrastructure. I don't have a problem navigating that. It's a machine that lets me get from up there down to here. If I were in a wheelchair or if I had mobility challenges, that's not infrastructure, that's a barrier, all right? So that point about the relational quality of infrastructure is actually essential to their understanding of the world, and I think is also a really essential piece of repair too, and we can talk about that as well. There's actually a much longer line of thinking about this, so I've already given you the bottom one. There are long traditions in the social sciences, and there's sort of a European line on this through phenomenology, but there's also an related American line on this through American pragmatism, which is about this point about the world disclosing properties of breakdown. So to go back to, for me, the beginning, that what I said earlier under the theory of infrastructure, that infrastructure is invisible until breakdown, is for me in some ways it's almost a very straight material retelling of John Dewey's theory of consciousness, which goes back 100 plus years now. So John Dewey's theory of consciousness essentially was that most of the time we don't think at all. Most of the time, we navigate through habit and routine. We kind of navigate the world on autopilot, as it were. Consciousness is actually the exception case. Thought is actually the exception case that kicks in when expectation breaks down. So to give an example, this will be maybe a very American or North American example. When I drive a car, I've been driving a car for many years now. When I drive a car, I don't think about driving a car, right? I get in my car in the morning, I have my coffee, I'm thinking about my day, I'm thinking about a conversation I had with somebody or an email I'm supposed to send. I'm just thinking about other things and driving on autopilot, essentially. The moment I get in the car, I go to start the engine and it doesn't start. All of a sudden, all of that drops away and I am now thinking about the car. Right? That's John Dewey's basic theory of consciousness and cognition. And you'll see how that carries through into the theory of infrastructure I've told you earlier. Okay, so that's the theory road in, if you want. And there is actually a parallel, very different, but in many ways parallel set of claims you could make coming out of phenomenology as well, in more of a European tradition. So people who are more attuned to this way of thinking might note something like Heidegger's distinction between tools that are present at hand versus tools that are ready to hand. A tool that is ready to hand, this is a good example. It's an automatic pencil. It has lead in it today, so if I went to write with it, it would work and it would remain ready to hand. If it was out of lead, or if I was writing and the lead broke, all of a sudden it becomes present at hand, right? It becomes no longer a tool that I use to accomplish a wider system of activity or a program of action in the world. It becomes the focus, right? Exact same principle I've told you. Heidegger's pencil, I guess, and Dewey's car are functioning in the same way here. Okay, so that's one way in, but the other way in, which is just as consequential, maybe more consequential, is a series of studies that for me go back to around 2010, mostly around technology repair, mobile phone and computing repair in particular, at a few different sites around the world. So the first field studies I was involved in here were actually in Namibia with students. It's not what we went to study. Actually, we went to study I think actually it was what we went to study was a computers in education program that was very promising, that the UN was very excited about, and everyone thought this was a great model for the future. And we got there, and all the computers were broken and sitting on shelves, and nobody was using them, right? So the whole thing we went to study was gone. It didn't, even though it had great videos and press releases, like in the world of symbolism and representation, this project was alive and well and still attracting donor dollars and things like that. In the actual world, it was not doing anything. So then we said, okay, we're here. This repair thing looks pretty interesting to study. And of course, one of the ironies, and people will begin to recognize, is that there's often a very strong separation between formal and informal repair circuits and repair networks. Some of you study this too in your own work. And the irony and the tragedy in this Kavango region of Namibia, kind of the northeast panhandle, if you want, was that these computers were sitting broken on shelves, while super vibrant and actually highly skilled repair cultures, mostly focused on mobile phones, were literally a mile away, and these worlds were not connecting. All right, so we did a series of studies here, a more extensive series of studies. Most of these images actually are from my, up in the upper left. This is actually my former PhD student, Ishtiaq Ahmed, who's now a faculty member, professor of computer science at University of Toronto. And he and some other collaborators and I did a series of studies in the Gulistan underground market in Dhaka, Bangladesh, around 2014, 2015, 2016, around then. And actually this last image on the right is from this year with another student, Daniel Mwasigwa. We've been looking at repair cultures in Uganda and East Africa. So there's a few different things we've studied in this world, and some of these things I think other people have been doing, and you will hear more about them later today. We became very interested in apprentice relations and modes of learning repair. Modes of learning repair are actually really interesting and distinct and powerful and challenging in their own right. We could talk about why that is. We talked about industrial and economic barriers to repair, including through the global organization of the tech industry. There's a strong separation between authorized and independent repair dealers that are tied in political economy terms, which I'll talk about maybe in a minute, are tied into the organization of the economics of the tech industry, and in particular, the desire to kind of control and capture and maintain a value stream well beyond the point of sale, which is something actually the tech industries have been innovating on and trying to push forward. So sort of going beyond a point of sale imagination of how economies work. We talked about global networks and linkages across our sites. It was really interesting to see how many of these things came together. So we would be doing field studies in Uganda or field studies in Bangladesh, and some of the same resources were showing up, and some of the same connections were showing up, and also some common practices, but named and sort of practiced slightly differently, which we could talk about. One of actually the thing I'm doing now with Daniel is a study about the moral orders of repair in Uganda. So looking at the forms of social organization and often informal rules. Rules has this interesting kind of structure or ambivalence we could talk about that actually govern when it's, what are the right forms of action vis-a-vis repair in a primarily informally organized economy. So there's some work, moral economies work we draw on in doing that. Interestingly, I was thinking, for those of us who did the museum tour at the City Museum last night, there was an interesting discussion about like people doing side work, right, or moonlighting, and sort of whether that was okay or whether it was not okay, and how even today some people would only give their first names because there was still some kind of a sense like, well, of course it was okay, everyone was doing it, but maybe it also wasn't okay. That had also a really strong sense of moral orders that we're seeing replicated here. Sort of the meta point of all of this, some of this, I guess, some of this was sort of in my world where innovation is told as a story that lives primarily in virtual forms. We tend to give all the love to the software engineers, and therefore we also tend to say technological innovation lives in places like Silicon Valley and similar spots to the world. When we say innovation in tech, people immediately think to that. For me, this is a way of globalizing the story of innovation in tech. So the kinds of things that are being done in these locations are skills that do not exist in North America. During the time of our work, the US government actually overhauled its visa categories, and one of the visa categories is a one called H-1B, which is usually thought of as the knowledge worker visa. It's the kind of thing that you get if you're a software engineer or you're a professor or an academic coming to work in the US. And they sort of re-upped the ante on all of these, and they added repair worker, technology repair worker, precisely because there was a recognition that these skills did not exist in the US, and that this was an important national priority by somebody to bring them in. So actually some of the people we studied in our field studies were in process of potentially emigrating to the US under this updated visa category. Okay. The other place that we were doing some work in parallel was around amateur repair movements and also legal and policy activism in North America and Europe. In particular, our work has been more in North America, but we partnered a lot with groups in Europe as well. So these are most of the images here, and the sort of bottom left corner are from a group called they were called the Brooklyn Fixers Collective. I think they're now called the New York Fixers Collective. They used to meet coming out of an art project, actually, at the Proteus Gowanus Gallery. Sam, I don't know if you've been to Proteus Gowanus. And then it carried forward into an ongoing fixing operation, very parallel to what you have in other places with repair cafes and things like that. So some of the things that we were interested in this work were really understanding the values that drove this. Why did people do this? And they were a mix, right? So sometimes they were environmental. Often they were economic, right? Like, yeah, it's only a $20 lamp from IKEA or whatever, but $20 is a lot of money. I would rather, fix it if I can. Some of it was just about social and a way of being with people in a meaningful and useful way. So there was a extraordinary number of I don't know if this was a sampling thing or how it worked out this way, but in the Brooklyn group, there was actually a very large number of retired AT&T engineers, AT&T being the national telephone company. We were talking with them, and they were like, look, I do tech stuff. Like, I'm good at this stuff. I actually enjoy it. I'm retired. I'm not working anymore. But what am I going to do? Take up golf? Like, take up some hobby I have no connection to? Like, for me, this is a way of exploring, expressing my skills, getting valued for my skills, right? Like, people actually care that I can do this stuff, and also making connections with people. So that's kind of on the social movement side, and I know we have a bunch of work here at the conference, so you'll get to hear a lot more about that in other contexts. We've also been really interested in how this plays out in political economy, so policy and economics. We've been involved, so there's a lot of complications around copyright, for example. Essentially what the tech firms have been doing for many years that is maybe beginning to break down a little bit is constructing repair monopolies. That would be my argument under antitrust. And so we've been part of the movement in the US to try and change state and hopefully eventually federal laws to allow for more robust forms of repair and restrict the kinds of practices that some manufacturers have been involved in to prevent it. You can think of these things, so part of that is about law and policy, part of it is about design, and when you put those two things together, you can think about that as screws and glues. That's the design part, right? We build devices, or we have built devices on average that are using, for example, proprietary screw heads, which are designed specifically to keep people out of their devices, or glues, right? So there have been varying forms of adhesive that have been added into tech products, phones, sometimes laptops, that essentially make them much more difficult to repair without destroying them. It's very hard to get them apart without destroying them. We've done a lot of work with a group called iFixit, which has a lot of great resources on this. So a couple of years ago, New York became the first US state to pass right to repair legislation. A number of others have followed since then, California, Minnesota, I think Colorado has as well. For me, we can talk about like the legislation in New York got a little bit hollowed out at the last minute, so we could talk about that if people are interested. But it's still an important step forward in the US context in particular, where it's hard to move laws like this. And my prediction now, we've also started to see the tech firms flip on this, and my prediction is that what you will see in the coming year is that all the tech firms which were fighting repair tooth and nail for years are in process of flipping, and now will become advocates of repair, because what they want now, I was chatting with somebody about this actually the other day, if you're Apple, and Apple was always kind of the main target of this, and we could talk about why, but if you're Apple or any other tech firm, your first choice is to have no regulation at all, right? That's ideally what you would want. You can do whatever you want. But the worst thing that can happen is if states start flipping, if states start putting in state-level right to repair legislation, the worst thing that can happen is 50 different sets of rules that you have to attend to and design your products to. So I think what often happens is when state-level legislation in the US begins to flip, you will sometimes see a reorganization and a reconsolidation on a unified federal law, which is one thing, instead of 50 different sets of rules. So we'll see what happens, but that's my prediction, and it's been an interesting part of the work. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about computing on Earth. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. In some ways, the computing on Earth concept, I have a lab that runs under this title. I teach a course, which I love teaching to undergrads, called Computing on Earth. And it's really trying to, in some sense, if you think about a lot of the work I've been doing has been around repair. In some sense, the computing on Earth work is an attempt to sort of put repair within the wider, sort of more comprehensive material flow and life cycle of computing and how it relates to the planet. So we are spending a lot of time looking at sourcing and extraction, energy and water, and waste and repair. And I'm going to say a couple of things about that. First of all, this is a quiz. It's a bit of a trick quiz. Any guesses at what this number series is? I see people counting. I see people doing the Fibonacci sequence. It's not that. So this is basically the recipe for your iPhone. All right. So if you broke, so now you could go out and make your own iPhone. There you go. There's the recipe. Understood at the level of elements. Of course, there's a lot of plastics, alloys, and processing. There's a lot of energy in your phone. There's a lot of water in your phone, many, many liters of water in your phone, actually. And there's a lot of oil in your phone, because that's also part of it. So part of this understanding, and actually students a few years ago in the class I taught, this is a bit faded now, I might have an image later, came up with nutrition labels for iPhones or smartphones in general. I'll put up the slide later, you can take a look, but the idea is you can actually understand your phone at the material level. This is a slightly more elaborate version, which goes into the different parts of a phone, screen, electronics, the casing, the battery. One of the things I want to communicate with my students when I teach is that your phone is a global traveler. Your phone, and almost no matter, this is true of me, it would be, I imagine it's true of all of you, no matter how much you've traveled around the world, your phone has traveled farther, right? So if you begin to attach some of the things that come out of the recipe to a map, this is part of what it looks like, right? So I'll talk through some of these examples in a minute. At this point, although it's beginning to shift potentially, a lot of the lithium used in phones and computers is coming from the Atacama Desert region, sort of at the intersection of sort of Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. That may be beginning to shift. I'll talk in a moment about mineral shortages, but there's other sources of lithium that may be coming online. So this is a rock called spodumene, which is a hard rock that contains lithium, and under new processing techniques may become a source of lithium. And the Canadian North is littered with it, as well as many other northern climes. So this will connect to some of the extraction points I'm going to make in a minute. We can talk about tin mining, where a lot of the solder for phones and electronics is coming from. Most of this is actually coming from these two islands in between kind of Kalimantan and Borneo, or Sumatra, Bentang and Bangka and Belitung. And you can see some of the forms. These islands, in some ways this is a time, you can almost see this as a series in time. So you can see one of the classic ways has been produced. Increasingly, you're getting more industrialized modes of extraction. Large parts of the islands are being washed away in this form. And what's happened over time is these are the near water islands off Bangka and Belitung, and near coastal tin extraction is becoming a major part of the endeavor in Bangka and Belitung, as the islands have essentially become hollowed out of tin. And actually, if we had a bigger screen and I had more pictures, you could continue to the next part, which would be deep sea mining of minerals like tin and other minerals that might be extracted. So this is definitely part of the planetary story of computing. We could talk about sourcing and extraction coltan mining in the African Great Lakes. We have partners we've worked with in the Democratic Republic of the Congo who are active around these issues, who have been in some danger, in fact, around these issues. People may be familiar with this. There are certainly labor abuses, including child labor, have in the past, and to some extent to this moment, been connected to these modes of coltan extraction in Africa. The role of the 3TG, what are often called the 3TG minerals, so tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, have been a major driver of conflict in the Great Lakes region of Africa. It's one of the things that people fight over, and it's one of the sources of money that allows militia and armies to continue to operate. There's a really nice anthropological account of this that came out last year by James Smith called The Eye of the World, which I'd point you to if you want to see a lot more about this, including some ambivalent efforts at regulation that had a complicated set of effects. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this part. What I want to say is that all of this together is driving what I think are likely to be one of the more consequential stories in the next 10 to 20 years in sort of global relations terms, which are new and radically expanded geographies of extraction. So people might recognize the tower. This is from Toronto. The world's largest mining conference happens every spring in Toronto. Toronto is really the mining capital of the world. More than 50% of major mining firms are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Bay Street, which is Canada's sort of equivalent to Wall Street, except it's all about extractive finance, is the major financer, major funder of extraction, mining-related extraction around the world. And I went there this spring, and the atmosphere of the room, so it's about 30,000 people come to this. It's like far larger than any academic conference I ever go to. I go to some big ones, but actually nothing like this. And the best way for me to describe the mood at this conference this year was giddy. People were wildly excited and enthusiastic at what the future holds for the mining industry. And when I talk to people who had been part of the mining industry for a long time, they say 20 years ago, that wasn't the story. 20 years ago, a lot of the firms, a lot of the industry felt a little bit moribund. It felt a little bit stuck. Now you see a lot of curves like this. So this is too small for you to see, but essentially these are maps of various minerals that will be important for the computing and the green energy transformation. And existing stocks and the demand curves are the ones that are wildly beyond existing stocks. So people would say things like, in order to meet currently documented green energy goals, and increasingly people are talking about AI goals as well, although that's a little more under the radar. We need to multiply the world lithium supply by a factor of 10 in the next 10 years. And then they would say, and on average, it takes 11 years to open a mine, right? So the whole point is that these geographies of extraction related to computing, even though computing tries to tell a story about itself that puts extraction way in the background, are essential to driving what will be a very wild transformation in the world. A project in particular I've started following is one in northern Canada called the Ring of Fire Project, which is a nickel project. Ontario Conservative Premier Rob Ford, he's the guy on the right here, has promised to make the project happen, even if he has to jump on a bulldozer himself. So there you go. This is the landscape it's being built over. So northern Canada has a lot of bogs too. I understand Estonia has bogs, and that, you know you've arrived if you go to the bog with your friends. Northern Ontario has a lot of bogs as well, and it's also one of the world's largest carbon sinks, sort of the Hudson Bay lowlands area. And this is where this, which is being built, is one of the largest nickel discoveries in many decades, is being built. The land is populated by members of the Ojibwe, Cree, and Ojibwe language groups. It's primarily indigenous land, and it is off the existing road network in northern Ontario. So a lot of the discussion is actually how to get the minerals out. And this sort of weird, this is a very strange image on the right. It is in fact a generative AI, DALL-E. What I did is I took my note. We have a campus-specific kind of cordoned off license to DALL-E, so it doesn't go back into the general corpus. I took some of my field notes and I entered it in and said, okay, DALL-E, what's happening in this scene? And they came up with this imagination of what Northern Ontario might look like once the Ring of Fire project is in place. And the weirdness of this is coming, I don't know where the boats come from. There was no discussion of boats, but there were discussions about building a monorail into the subarctic, sort of 300 miles across the tundra. There's a lot of discussion about floating roads, how you could actually build a 200 or 300 mile floating road across the Arctic, including really fast. I talked for like 2 hours with this really fascinating wildlife biologist who was working for a mining company, who was looking at the conditions under which moose do and don't cross roads. And apparently there's a huge debate. Sorry, this is absolutely not knowledge you will ever need for anything, but I find it really interesting. There's a huge debate within the wildlife biology community whether the problem of a northern road is the visual problem of a line, that moose are put off by the line, or whether it's the feeling of the road under their feet. So there you go. I don't know the answer. If you know the answer, maybe you know the answer, you could help sort this out. All right. Oh, and this was what I just mentioned earlier, the student work. Energy and water, I'm going to go through very quickly. You've probably seen graphs like this before. It's looking at data center energy consumption, water as well. Sometimes people think about the energy side and they forget about the water side, but water consumption actually is an essential part of this. There's been a growing, what's sometimes called the green AI movement. This is actually older, a much older study now. It's wildly out of date because the world has changed so much. But even at this time, researchers were beginning to ask, sort of internally in the academic community, is, are there different ways of writing code? Are there different ways of running AI that is not just brute force, right? Most of the AI work right now puts no premium on energy. Student work puts no premium on energy. Sort of academic work puts very little premium. Industry work puts less energy premium on efficiency. So could you write different code that actually had a different kind of environmental footprint? And you see things like this from now, again, wildly old, but essentially you can see training your average large language model, transformer model, is something like, takes something like 6 cars worth of six lifetime energy carbon footprint of cars. And of course, many of these things are being built all the time. So this has driven, it's been interesting. There's a lot of work around code and data center efficiency. I want to call out the rebound effect because this was something that was brought home to me by people who work in data center efficiency. I was at a very technical conference last month in North Carolina. Like, it was very hard for me to follow what was going on, but it was all these people who do data center efficiency, essentially, like new architectures, new data center architectures, new code architectures, basically, for greener computing. And the guy who organized it took me aside at one point. It was like 3 different conferences that meet together. It was quite a big event. He took me aside at one point and he said, you know, I've been working on efficiency in computing motivated by sustainability reasons for my whole career. Like, my whole career has been, he's very good. He's like, he was the leader of the conference, leader in the field. And what he said is, I think my whole career has been a waste of time because every time we make it more efficient, people just use more of it, right? So that's the rebound effect. And it's now become a dominant, to the point of like all the stuff about efficiency, what's even the point, right? This is from a leading researcher in the field. We've been doing a lot of work around bad architectures like Bitcoin. So this happens to be a local version. This is in upstate New York. The stories of the world kind of Bitcoin industry, sort of a hackneyed story of it is a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when China clamped down on Bitcoin in China, the industry went elsewhere. A lot of it actually went to North America, and New York State became a world center for Bitcoin for a period of time. There's been action since then to kind of pull back on that. But this is a facility called the Greenidge Bitcoin Mining Facility on Seneca Lake, which is one lake over from the lake that I'm on in Ithaca. And we've been doing this, and actually this is what they look like. If it weren't so heavy and didn't look so suspicious, I would have loved to have brought this here to show you because it really, the Bitmain Antminer S9, that would be a Bitcoin rig circa about 2015. So it's not, this one's not in place now. You can actually buy them online. I did buy this one online. And in places that have had Bitcoin, this is actually kind of a weird, I'm not quite sure, circular economy story. I was talking with the mayor of Plattsburgh, New York, who also wrote a book on Bitcoin, and they had a big Bitcoin operation in and around Plattsburgh, which ended up driving up people's energy rates because Bitcoin was taking up so much energy, the energy became more expensive for residents. But what he said is that eventually that when these things get shuffled out from the plant there, or have been shuffled out from the plant there, people buy them as space heaters for their homes. So they're generating enough heat that they actually work pretty well as space heaters, which is scary when you think about you put 5 or 10,000 of these together, the kinds of energy it must take to cool a warehouse full of 5 to 10,000 space heaters. Okay, waste I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. And how am I doing on time, actually? Should I? 10 minutes? Okay, good. Oh, good. Okay, excellent. So I'll say a little bit about this. So we have been doing more work lately on the waste side. You can think of waste and repair as kind of a pairing in material flow kinds of terms. I actually came into it, as you know, through repair. But I have been doing work on waste, including some of the earlier stuff. This is a very famous site in world debates around e-waste. So around in 2014, the Guardian newspaper published a famous photographic expose of e-waste in Agbogbloshi, which is in Accra in Ghana. This photo is actually later. This is not one of the Guardian photos. This is from 2019. And this is copper recycling there. So it's pretty obvious what they're doing. They're melting the cover off the wire to recover the copper. And of course, there have been a lot of concerns and increasing studies on the health effects of this. There's a really good NGO group that some of you might know called the Basel Action Network, which is probably the main global watchdog on e-waste flows. And they try and do things like map transboundary movements of like electrical and electronic waste. They have a monitor that they publish. One of the most interesting things they do, and we're now working with them to replicate this at my local university. Don't tell anyone actually, because it's we want to do it as a natural experiment. One of the things that the Basel Action Network, started a few years ago is what they call the e-transparency project. And in the e-transparency project, they attach little GPS units to waste, electronic waste, and then they just watch. They see where it goes. So they've done this now from a number of countries. This one happens to be from Canada, but there are ones from many different countries or from the EU as a whole. And one of the things that this is meant to do is to map more systematically, and their trackers work for about 3 years before they conk out typically. But one of the things this is meant to do is kind of to give begin to suggest a global picture of e-waste flows. But the other thing to do is it's kind of an auditing function, and that's how I want to use it at my university. Is my university has contracted with an ethical recycler, right? And a recycler that agrees to adhere to certain kinds of practices. But there's very little monitoring of such things. And what the ban work elsewhere has shown is that a lot of the e-waste flows are in fact coming through certified recyclers, right? So recyclers that have been certified not to send e-waste from Estonia or Denmark or Canada to the global south are in fact sending it to the global south. So that's something that we've been working on. To tie back to fieldwork a little bit, my first encounter with this actually came through the work in Bangladesh now, I guess about 10 years ago. And this again is fieldwork with Ishtiaq Ahmed, a former student. And this is with the Bangari, or the waste collecting community, which we're sort of an ancillary community to the repair communities who are our sort of primary target of study. And it was so what Ishtiaq and colleagues did was begin to ask people in the Bangari community what their sense of health was and what their theories of what was happening to them were as they worked with electronic waste. And so you see some of the problems that are identified here: skin problems in hand and feet, reduced eyesight and burning eyes, breathing problems, many respiratory problems, and appetite, reduced hunger. And then this, I'll just read this because I think it's quite striking as a self-account of harm from waste. I asked for an example from each of these are from field notes. I asked for an example from each of them. They pointed their fingers to dark spots on the boards. One of them said, "This is burnt, and this now emits poison to you. You touch this, and you start rotting. We work here because we don't have any other option. We have touched this, so now we are now having problems because of the poison." Another one pointed to the backside of the motherboard where there were many pins. He said, "These pins are dangerous. When you work with the motherboards, it is natural that the pins will hurt you. Those pins will reach your blood and bring the poison there." Then he showed me his hands and said, "I have hundreds of such wounds. I am poisoned." Another Bangari told me how his son became ill, and then he stopped touching his son. Another Bangari thinks he is now addicted to the poison, just like drugs. So these are self-accounts. These are folk theories of harm that have been experienced in the line of this work. At the time that we were collecting these in 2014, 2015, there wasn't a lot of scientific work we could find to kind of read these against. There's been more that's come out since then. So in the last I'd say 5 years in particular, we're beginning to see the beginnings of a robust toxicology and waste literature that's looking at the relations between some of the health effects, right? So effects on hormones, livers, renal function, but also effects on soil. So one of the things, in a minute, I'll talk about a project that connects to this. We've become very interested in is what's happening at the soil level when waste meets soil. What is happening there? Can we actually study this? Can we actually document this? So all I want to say on this, and if I had more time, I would draw a fancier diagram. The computing industry is fundamentally uncircular in its current organization, right? This is a line. This is basically a line. There have been small efforts to improve that, to maybe bend things around, but they are small, they are incipient, and the basic ethos and organization of the industry is still very much in a linear mode. It's not oriented in its core to sustainability, and it is, as I tell my colleagues and students, fundamentally unsustainable at every level, right? As AI ramps up, its fundamental unsustainability is just magnifying. The other thing I'll note is that the kinds of effects and concerns that I've talked about here are denied in the exceptionalist stories we tell about computing, right? When we talk about computing being in the cloud, that is a way of not talking about computing here and here and here, right? So we have to change the stories. We have to tell different stories about computing if we're ever going to have a hope of tackling what it's doing on the planet and to the planet. That's not the only way computing could be, one can imagine. So I'll call out a couple of projects that I think are kind of fun and interesting. This is a group I just visited in Copenhagen. It's called the Eco-Metabolistic Architecture Project. It's from a group called the Center for Information Technology and Architecture in Copenhagen. And they are doing 3D printing with biomaterials, right? So if you think of 3D printing, usually it's plastic. Sometimes it's about, in the sort of hobbyist versions, it's usually about essentially creating the equivalent of 3D plastic disposable trinkets. But 3D printing doesn't have to be that way. So this is a group that is actually experimenting with a variety of plant-based things. This thing on the left is bone meal that is being claimed from local slaughterhouses and is being used as a binding agent along with, in varying recipes, right? So that stack of bins, there are varying recipes that are then put through sort of a customized 3D printer that has different ways of extruding, projecting the material into forms, and they're producing things like this. So this on the right is an example of some of the things they printed. It's very much at the level of materials experiment. So what they're doing is they produce this stuff and they hang it outside and see what happens as it goes through temperature changes and humidity changes and sunlight. So it's very much at the level of basic materials research. But in my mind, it's a more hopeful path, or it could be a more hopeful path, or the beginning of a more hopeful path than the purely plastics-driven model of 3D printing that has tended to dominate so far. This is my labor of love project right now. So we're doing a project with local farmers in the upstate New York and in the Nova Scotia area that is about soil acoustics. So soil acoustics, if we start, that's one of the farmers we've interviewed in Ithaca. We then have been building these mics, very sensitive mics that are based on earthquake research, actually. They're seismic in origin, adapted seismic mics, basically. So we've been constructing these mics, and we're beginning to record soil sounds. And there is actually a scientific literature on this in soil science that's kind of incipient. It's it's like the beginnings. I'm not sure a real soil scientist would take this as a super deep technique, but they're beginning to get interest in actual soil science journals, not by us, other people have been doing this work. And what they're saying is that soil acoustics can be a really good proxy for soil health in general. And you can track, right, like in some of the studies that have been done, soils that are treated we've been working with permaculture and organic and community-supported agriculturalists mostly, and exclusively actually in our work. And soils that are treated and maintained in that way have an entirely different sound footprint, a sound print, than your average agriculture petrochemical field. Essentially, petrochemical fields are silent, and these fields are noisy. I mean, you have to do a lot to hear them. They're very sensitive mics. You have to pitch shift it 2 octaves because a lot of the sounds are below the level of human hearing. And that's an example of us recording some of those soils. And then here's one other example. This is an older project, but I'll share it and then I'll move on to a conclusion. This was in some of our early work with the New York groups. We also came to work with a New York multimedia artist, Tezu Park, who has run a long series called Digital Being, in which he's really interested in kind of the personalities and using e-waste as a way of building new kinds of new media art. So in our work with Tezu and my former PhD student, Leo, we came up with an installation called Scale, which played at a number of places. This is actually its gallery version. Its more interesting version, although it was messier aesthetically, was actually at the World Maker Faire in New York in 2014. And the reason it was such an interesting thing to have there is that it was entirely at odds with much of the ethos of the Maker Faire and maker culture at that time in particular. I know people here do some work on this, so we could talk about repair cultures and maker cultures, maker movement cultures if you want. But let me just show you what that looked like. All right, so a last point before a conclusion, infrastructures for a fragile planet. So one of the things, as you know, I care about and study infrastructures at many scales and in many different ways. And one of the things I've been most struck by, and we're beginning to see discussions emerge from, is how many of the modernist infrastructures that we built on and around and sometimes for the planet are beginning to melt, actually. And we see examples of this. So this is a picture of rails in the American West. As you all know, the American rail system is not that great to begin with. We look with envy at Europe on this question. But this is increasingly what some of the rails in the American West are looking like. They were not built to withstand the temperatures that we are now moving into. They were not built with expansion joints sufficient for the temperatures, summertime temperatures we're now seeing. And you're beginning to see things like this. So some rails have been rendered, lines have been rendered inoperable at certain key points. Some lines have been, are still usable, but at half speed, right? So the whole rail system is losing capacity and it's losing speed at a moment where rail still might actually be, or ideally could be, part of a response to transport needs that we're struggling with elsewhere. The other one I want to call out, just because it's a distinct thing that is not a story that should be better known. I mentioned earlier the work in Northern Ontario. The picture in the middle is a picture of one of the Northern Canadian ice roads. So there are about 10,000 kilometers of ice roads in Northern Canada that are seasonal roads that basically in the winter, rivers freeze or bogs freeze, and roads are built for a few months to supply the northern parts of the country. It primarily serves indigenous populations who are off the southern road grid. And what's increasingly been happening is the ice roads are not coming in with the length or the reliability that they used to. And I have a personal connection to this because my brother-in-law was a bush plane pilot in Northern Ontario. And you could always tell when it was a bad year on the ice roads because the traffic load on the fly-in companies went up astronomically because the only way to get in and out of lands was that. And the only way to get heavy building supplies in also became planes. And of course, that becomes wildly expensive. So in some ways, you can, the easiest way to tell whether the ice roads have come in or not in a particular northern community is to check the price of bacon in the local store. Because in a year when the ice roads haven't come in, bacon goes up to $25 or $30 a pack. So this is actually an economic catastrophe, in particular for indigenous communities in the north part of the country, that Southern Canadians have not recognized and not taken action on. The image on the right is from New Orleans, and it's from the fieldwork of a really amazing PhD student of mine now, Jen Liu, who's studying basically the decline and the repair and the withdrawal of infrastructure as parts of southern Louisiana go back into the water or are destroyed by storms. So southern Louisiana has actually become, there's a particular place in southern Louisiana called Ile de Jean Charles, which is the first recognized, whose community is the first recognized climate refugees in the US. So they have been permanently removed from their land after 98% of the land was lost between 1955 to the present. One road that connects the island onto the mainland is basically the government said, we're not rebuilding the road anymore. It's just gonna be destroyed next year. And so that community has now been relocated, and they are the first internal climate refugees in the US. And then finally, this is increasingly, I just find this such a strange story. We're beginning to see the phenomenon in the American Southwest of pavement burns. And a pavement burn is a situation in which the temperature of asphalt has become hot enough that people who pass out and are on the ground can sustain very serious to life-threatening burns just because the temperature of the pavement has become that hot. Okay. Seems like a weird transition, but it's not. I want to conclude with a word on hope and how ongoing practices of maintenance and repair, broadly conceived, may still help us to navigate, sustain, and make meaning in and with the broken worlds around us. And this is mostly coming from a set of things I've been thinking about for a long time, but finally came out in this article that a bunch of great scholars were involved in. The collection as a whole is really interesting, so I encourage you to take a look if you have a chance. And basically, it's an effort to rethink the category of hope a little bit in the social sciences and in the humanities, and also in a way that those fields connect with the planetary. And so these are just a series of propositions that it advances and tries to convince people of or suggest to people in the talk. Hope is not predictive and therefore cannot be falsified or disproved. The point of hope is not whether it's accurate. The point of hope is whether it's effective, whether it actually motivates and keeps action moving forward in the world. Hope may be expressed in change and transformation, but also more modest forms of patience and enduring. This gets back to the point about what's to be explained, change or continuity. While often called to the fore in moments of crisis and transition, hope is above all a property of ordinary work, from whence comes its depth and power. And it's interesting, in visiting the exhibitions yesterday, I saw tons of ordinary hope. Like when I at the Road Museum, when there was the kid on the skis with the crazy contraption on his back, first of all, I thought that would totally be my son. He would totally have done something like that. But also, that's the kind of ordinary hope I'm imagining, right? The staying with the trouble, the keeping things going in the world, the finding, it's not about this is going to change the world, like it's going to radically revolutionize things. But it's an effort and a commitment to keep going. And finally, hope is a collective accomplishment, something we do together in the world in concert with others and with things. So hope is a shared project, right? Hope is not an attitude or an affect or an individual emotion or a feeling or an attitude. Hope is a practice. Hope is something we do. Hope is connected to agency and giving ourselves and relying on our senses of agency and supporting other senses of agency in the world and in the community around us. So there's some work, some discussion in the paper that actually comes from a religious studies scholar, a Kiba learner, about a distinction between vertical versus horizontal hope. Vertical hope being for Lerner, and he looks at a variety of religious traditions, being sort of an escapist fantasy. I'm going to escape into a future. I actually think that rockets taking off into to space is a version of that, versus a horizontal hope, a hope that's built in and with the worlds and people around us. Hope is not about, even in its modest form, is not just about quietism and waiting. Hope is a material mode of work and action. And then finally, I'm really interested in the world-making power of hope. So there's a line in the essay about, we could have been and might yet be otherwise. That's the world-making power of hope. So what might this mean for our discussions here this week? I'll leave that kind of hanging and we can discuss as people would like. Some things that I think are common tensions and questions around repair. The link and the balance between whether it's conservative or transformative. My understanding is both, but it's including the transformative part, modestly transformative. Put differently, maintenance builds worlds forwards and not just backwards. There's an ambivalence to repair, right? In traditions of work that have come up including my own, come up to celebrate and valorize forms of action like repair that have traditionally been underappreciated. We also have to think about, do we risk falling into a romanticism of repair? And do we have to take steps to guard against that? I'm very interested in the improvisational character of repair and its intersection with planning. There's important questions of scale we might talk about in our work together this week. How do we think about the relationship between repair acts, individual repair acts, individual objects, and wider repair worlds and cultures, maybe objects and infrastructures? I think, as noted earlier, and I know some people will be talking about this, I think the ways in which repair is learned and transmitted, including culturally, is fascinating and complex. And then in some ways, the thing I'm most excited for us to be together about and talking under this common theme about the different things we all do is the essential point about the pluralism of repair. So the cultural, geographic, and disciplinary range, right? I've shown you a few things from my work that are very specific to very specific places. Your worlds may look similar, your worlds may look different. And one of the reasons I'm particularly excited at the non-disciplinary framing of this event, that we're not gathering under the umbrella of an existing disciplinary structure, is that I actually think it can support that kind of learning across disciplines, but also across places and across cultures. There's a lot of fellow traveler terms, right, that come up in repair: maintenance, renovation, reuse, mending, care, I will argue hope. We could think about how those words relate. Where are they? Where do they overlap? Where do they depart from each other? Where is repair the right word to use? Where is another kind of language a more effective one? And relatedly, does repair name things that other languages and principles don't? Sustainability, circular economy, degrowth. There's a small field of work called permacomputing, which I'm kind of interested in because it connects to my computing on Earth interest. But if any of you are permacomputerists, I'd be happy to chat with you after. That's a slide. And yeah, did that one. The last thing I want to say, though, is the point about that I mentioned a minute ago, indirectly, with the celebration of the kid on the skis with the weird contraption, which I think was like a fan to make him go faster, is repair as an art of living, right? Repair and ordinary hope as an art of living, which for me means full of the joy, complexity, creativity, beauty, surprise, ambivalence, and radical uncertainty of life. I think this is different than the sometimes thin and economic or survivalist logics that also can show up in sustainability circles. But I would say that if we lose this sense of wonder and imagination, we risk passing into what Chief Seattle warned of his message to Washington in 1854, the end of living and the beginning of survival. I've always found that line chilling, and we could think about that. What does it mean to hit the end of living and the beginning of survival? And where are we on that relation? And how do we stay on the art of living and not drift into the beginning of survival? Finally, a simple word on agency and the action orientation of repair. This is sort of a bookend, if you want, to the opening words. These are the closing words of the Ordinary Hope essay. The world is always breaking, carrying much of what we care about into loss and oblivion. There is nothing and no one to save us. We are always and everywhere alone, but for the profuse and teeming worlds around us. Now let us get to work. So that's a good way to stop a keynote as we head into a really fantastic set of activities over the next couple days. Let's get to work. Thank you.
Okay, so is this working? Yeah. We have about 30 minutes for question and answers. If there are any questions from the audience, I would like to open the floor to you all. Yes? Could you give the mic there? Yeah. Take a seat.
Thank you for a very rich talk and interesting talk. I have a reflection, perhaps more than a question. It's funny. I think I need more time to process everything that you talked about. I have a really good question. But I was thinking, in particular, at one point you're talking about the iFixit movement. You had a nice picture of people up there.
Mm-hmm.
And you ended up with a picture of sort of the art of living. And it made me think of some work I did about 15 years ago. I don't know how I got into it, but I was doing work on Swedish spas. And I was out there trying to talk to people about why they're going to spas and what they're doing. And they said, we don't do anything. We did nothing. And we just sat around. And I couldn't get people to talk about what they're actually doing at spas. But in terms of what we're talking about here, in some ways, they were fixing themselves. It was a repair work in some ways. And it came at a time in which people were burning out. It was a sort of a pandemic in Sweden. So spas found a new life in Sweden in this pandemic. But they would go there and do things, and they couldn't put the words into what they're doing. But But what I found out and what kind of surprised me a lot is despite the fact the Swedes are so secular and rational and gray and boring and everything they claim to be, it was a lot about belief. And there's a lot of belief happening there. And I was thinking a little bit with that picture with the I fix it and the people sort of working with their hands and doing something. And what that means to actually, haptically, to physically engage with the world and feel as if you're doing something. And how that links into belief. And perhaps you're talking about hope here also.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about sort of the small things in life which might take us away from that tipping point. And how we can sort of appreciate what it means to actually believe that I'm doing something now which has an effect in the world, and how can we encourage those types of beliefs? I'd like to just hear if you could develop a little bit more. I think some of the final points you're talking about here in terms of the art of living and hope.
Yeah. That's a great example. I'm super interested in that. And it strikes me sort of methodologically, it seems to me like that's a common challenge of studying very ordinary forms of work, including repair, right? Like how do you get people to actually remark on? It's one of the reasons why interviews I think are sometimes tricky, and sometimes you just have to be there and you have to observe and you have to sort of live with it and go with it. I do think that for me, my interest in kind of the action orientation of hope or understandings of hope as a practice really are about kind of building that. I mean, it goes back a little bit to the building habits and routines, but building practices that support a modest sense of agency and efficacy in the world, right? So when people are fixing things at like a iFixit session or a repair cafe or whatever, I think there's a lot of different things happening, right? Some of it is community building, some of it is exercising skills that maybe they hadn't had a chance to exercise and they're proud of those skills. Some of it is just building and understanding. I mean, this is how I think one of my critiques is how sort of the cultures of computing we built, right? Cultures of technology we built. Some of it is just understanding that technical objects are things that can be worked on, and that a person who is not a software engineer or who never thinks of themselves as a technical person actually has agency and efficacy vis-a-vis that object. And part of the function then of the group or the community is bolstering that sense of shared agency and efficacy. And some of that is by teaching, right? Like you know a particular technique and you help me learn it. Some of it is just by sort of fixing alongside, right? Like you or I might be fixing alongside each other, and you may have, neither one of us may have particular expertise, but we're trying things out together. And so there is something in that action orientation. And one of the reasons I make a point of that in the discussions of hope is because I think that hope is so often misunderstood as an attitude or an emotion or a purely affective thing, and not actually as kind of a muscle that people can exercise and engage. And I think we need more of that, right? Because I think if we don't have, the other reason that I care about that is that I feel like, you'd mentioned it at in the introduction. I lived, so one of my funnest academic jobs so far is I lived for 6 years with my family with 300 undergraduates in a residence at Cornell. So that's what meant being the dean of William Keaton House meant, is that I lived with 300 undergrads. And, I could go on and on about that. It was really an amazing experience in lots of different ways, and not all of them were easy. But my one takeaway from that, and I would say this of those undergrads, but I then would generalize it maybe to people in general, is that those students needed hope like they needed oxygen. And I was cognizant of the fact that our institutions are not always good at delivering it to them. That the way we engage the world as academics is not always communicated in the form that students can experience it as a practice of hope, and therefore something they can engage in and emulate and build in their own lives. So I think the spa example is actually a really rich and interesting example. And it's a really nice example of the ordinary character of that, right? Like I would say that, like the way you described, they were fixing themselves, they were building resiliency, maybe they were building some sense of community or being with others. But they were also maybe practicing a sense of efficacy and practice and something that they could, even if they were working on themselves, they were doing things. And maybe for them, it didn't rise to the level of remark, right? We're doing nothing. But in fact, I don't think they were doing nothing from your description. I think they were doing something probably small but quite important.
I see another.
Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for the organizers. I have been in several seminars this month, and I feel like most like home here. And my question actually is connected to that, like we are among like-minded people here, and your presentation was directed for us, but what kind of a talk you would have given to those mining professionals who were really happy about the future views, and would that be different, or did you give a talk there, or?
I didn't give a talk there. I was in pure ethnography mode, so I didn't give a talk. But I did talk to people. And you know what, I talked to a lot of people, and I should say this is kind of an interesting side note. So it was not an academic conference, it was very much an industry conference. And the part I didn't mention because of time was my grandfather was a nickel miner at what was then the world's largest nickel company in Sudbury, Ontario, Northern Ontario, a fair ways south of where the new location is, but same general area. And so I totally understood. I actually felt very at home in that culture because I grew up in like an industrial steel town, and the next town over was where my grandfather was a nickel miner. Like that culture is not foreign to me. And it was interesting, actually, my point of entree, I was able to have a lot of rich and interesting ethnographic discussions, not because I was an academic. Like I had a name tag. I was the only person I saw who seemed to be attached to a university. But once I mentioned that my grandfather was a miner at Inco, then I was a nickel kid. And then the world opened up to me, and I was invited into all these different things. And there is a lot of care in that world, right? I mean, I know this from my background and upbringing. So, and there's also important ambivalence in that world, right? So there are people who are working in those sectors who share many of the same concerns that we might share here. I don't think the worlds are quite as different. The public face of those worlds are very different, but the internal practice of those worlds is maybe a little less different, I think, than we imagine. And one of my questions, actually, this sort of weird button, you probably can't see it, but it's a badge that a friend of mine made a few years ago. It just says, "What if I'm wrong?" And I wear it. I actually wear it around, and I usually wear it to teach. And one of the things I feel like we're maybe struggling with in the United States, I mean, obviously it's a particular kind of week in the US, but I think that we're struggling with a bit of a crisis of certainty, that people are a little too certain about whatever they're certain about, and our ability to actually speak and listen across those kinds of divides is weaker. So I actually think I would give a pretty similar talk if I was able to give a talk at the thing. And certainly when I talk to people, in conversation at that event, it wasn't wildly different. I mean, I was able to say these things, not short forms of these things. And they were able to say, well, yeah, okay, I get that. And yeah, I can understand that. And maybe, but what about this? And yeah, I was like, yeah, okay, I understand that too. So I don't know, that's probably a bit of a rambly answer, but I do think it's incumbent on us to talk in ways, I mean, to me, this would be also part of repair, a scholarly practice of repair, and maybe it's endemic to the practice of ordinary hope, is to speak in a way that invites in, like that really listens. One of my advisors talked about listening forth, which was kind of like a listening on the edge of your seat. So when you're talking to someone, especially when you're talking to somebody who may have a really different understanding of the world, and I actually think this is a core ethnographer's skill and practice, is you're not just listening passively, you're like leaning forward to listen, right? You're leaning forward to understand exactly, to the extent you can, understanding you will never get to the bottom of it. How is it possible to think that, right? How is it possible to understand the world in a really different way? And whenever we practice that, I mean, ethnographers get to do this as a matter of our trade. It's one of the reasons I love doing work in this vein. You usually find that the caricatures of those worlds almost never hold up, right? That the people at the mining conference were of many kinds, and they had rich and interesting understandings on the world, and they may not have landed in the same place on the meta questions as I might, but they had a way of getting there, and it was coming from somewhere, and it wasn't because there was a simple moral good and bad coding that determined that. It was people were speaking from their lives and thinking from their lives, and they were landing in different places because they had different lives. And that's the sense that I would always want us to take. I think it's incumbent to repair as a scholarly practice.
Do you think you need to have like a level of amorality? And that kind of also gets embedded into you when you are trained as an ethnographer. So that's sort of like the starting point.
Yeah, I sort of think that's true. And I mean, I'm not sure if it's amorality. I would say maybe it's a suspension of judgment. So maybe that's the same thing. I think there are, like when I do my work, I think there are deep normative stakes usually to what I do and care about, and reasons I am interested in some projects and not in others. But I try not to wear my normativities on my sleeve, because I find that in many instances it prevents exactly that kind of listening forth that I think is essential. I think is essential to good ethnographic work. And it's also essential to ethnographic surprise, right? That's the other thing, is that if you wear your normativities on your sleeve, sometimes you just go in and find the thing that you had already constructed in your head. It's easy to do. I mean, that's the easiest kind of research to do, right? Go have a plan, already know how the world works, go out and cherry pick it, find it, surprise, lines up. So I always think about, like, what is the mode of going into work, into the field, that still allows us to be surprised? And I think that kind of maybe a suspension, I would say, because it doesn't, a partial suspension maybe of normativities is one of the ways that I tend to operate.
I have a question, and it's kind of like linking back to the work you did in Bangladesh and also in Africa, and then the work that you've done in North America. In what surprising ways has hope surfaced in these spaces where you've done your work, and how do you see people practicing hope?
That's such a good question. I haven't really thought, it's interesting, I haven't really thought sort of this questions of hope, which I've been coming to more recently, back to some of that early field work, I would say. But I would say, if I do that kind of live in the moment, I would say that where I saw those kinds of ordinary hope operating, it was in the daily kinds of interactions, the very mundane moments that structured repair in those worlds. So it wasn't like at one point I'd mentioned the visa categories and the fact that some of the people in the study were maybe thinking about emigrating. But that's not really and there's certainly a lot of complex hope in that as well. But that's actually not the most striking. It's not the version that I would look to if I was saying, where do I find hope in those worlds in that scene? It's more the daily kinds of interactions and engagements, the keeping going, the stay. Sometimes in a very technical level, staying with the fix. Right. There are many instances in which technical fixes become very fraught. Would be the easiest thing would be to say, yeah, forget it. Sorry, client, can't do it. But there's really kind of many instances in which people really kind of got into it and they stuck with it and they went like beyond all economic rationality. Like they spent way more time than it would ever make sense in an economic sense to fix this phone. And part of it was the puzzle, part of it was the challenge, part of it was a sense of obligation, right? Like I have this skill, this is my job. So I would say that's where I would look for the ordinary hope, and it's a little bit like you were saying. It's so mundane that it almost doesn't merit remark, right? Like it's not like I didn't at that time in particular. Wouldn't even have thought to characterize it as hope because it doesn't jump off the page or jump out of the scene in that way.
Does anyone else? Yeah. Oh, okay. So we have like maybe a few minutes left. I think I would be very curious to hear if we go back a little bit to maybe put the focus on the human behind the behind the scholar. What were your major motivations that led you into the study of repair, and how has your practice, perception, your being in the world shifted?
Well, I kind of gave you a couple answers to that in terms of why repair. Like in some ways, what I would say if we put together kind of what I talked about as the theoretical road in and the empirical road in. I mean, I think this is actually how a lot of scholars find their areas and their projects is like, I'm a practitioner, I guess, on some level of grounded theory in social science analysis, and a really strict definition of grounded theory is almost like imagines a blank slate model. Like you go in with no preconceptions. You're very careful not to sort of, it's almost got a scientific quality. But anyone who actually practices it and practices it well, and Lee Starr, one of my advisors, who was a student of Anselm Strauss, who was one of the kind of parent figures of that field, she never bought that version of grounded theory, even though she would be regarded as a really leading practitioner of her generation in it. So I would say that when I encountered in that Namibian case, for example, when we went to study something else, and then we started saying, well, what's actually happening in this scene? That's a place where I feel like the theoretical presuppositions do kind of like that it becomes a choosing or sort of melding of those two streams. I mean, I would say that just what I enjoy about studying repair kind of more generally is I also enjoy, I'm not good at it, I should say. Even though I've studied it a while, I'm not a terribly skilled repairer, but I admire it and I value it and I actually really enjoy it, even though I'm not that good at it. And so for me, there's something about that nature, the tactile nature of it, the open-ended nature of it. I do think the improvisational character of repair is super interesting, and it makes it a fascinating kind of site. I actually think there's a lot of, one of my favorite articles actually, which is obscure, usually pretty obscure, is this beautiful study called Plans, Takes, and Mistakes. And it's by a team of educational researchers out of Stanford University. Came out in like 2006 or something. Nathaniel Klemp is the first author, and then there's a whole string of other authors. And it's a study of a Thelonious Monk, a wrong note in a Thelonious Monk performance, jazz performance, and then all the work that goes on through the rest of the performance by all the members of the group to make that wrong note right. Right. So in retrospect, and it's become, now it's one of his most famous recordings. It's a recording called In Walked Bud, for those of you who know jazz. But that improvisational character, the open-ended nature of it, and that is also a place where repair and hope connect. So like in the hope, sort of the larger theories of hope or philosophies of hope that come in somewhat obliquely into this piece I mentioned. One of the scholars there is a guy named Ernst Bloch, and he wrote a book called The Principle of Hope. Actually, it's a few books that kind of get combined into a thing. And he talks about the not yetness of hope, that open-endedness of it. And I think repair also has a not yetness to it, right? Especially if we think of repair as not only a return to an original function, right? If we have a more expansive concept of repair that doesn't say repair is only about restoring to original function, but that repair is also, in some ways, building a new kind of object, but with some accountability to the old. It's not like a blank slate idea of innovation. This is where I think a repair-centered, if repair could colonize innovation rather than the other way around, that would be kind of a good thing. Because I actually think that a repair-centered notion of innovation could actually be really powerful, because there are important questions of change that repair embeds in this particular way that most of our existing understandings and discourses of innovation I don't think it doesn't name it correctly.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and your insights and your philosophies with us. This has been a very inspiring start to the day, and I think we can close the session. And what's next, then I will hand them.
Firstly, big applause. Thank you very much.
No.